Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Michael Gera, and we are here to go over maximizing Microsoft Excel for HIM professionals, importing and transforming data into actionable information. Today's June 18th, 2013. We're coming to you from the City University of New York. My name is Michael Gera. My contact information is down below, mgera@healthcarepctraining.com. Before we begin, let me just say that I'll review my contact information at the end. You're welcome to submit questions during the course of the webinar. I will do my best to answer as many of them as I possibly can. Those that we are unable to get to within our 90 minutes, we will try to answer. We will answer on several days, within several days of this seminar. Now, today's topic is a fairly complicated one, but yet one that can be made fairly straightforward if one uses the right tools, and that is what we'll be reviewing today. We're going to be concentrating on several aspects of Microsoft Excel that are useful for pulling data from third-party sources. We're going to be talking about how you can import data into Microsoft Excel from a third-party source and then transform that data into some sort of actionable information. Now, if you recall, in previous seminars, we've talked about some of the typical uses for Microsoft Excel, specifically for the HIM environment. Clearly, we all know about sorting information. We all work with creating charts and graphs from time to time. We spend lots and lots of time talking about lists of patients, providers, employees. It seems like Excel is really a very useful tool that people use for creating lists. And although it does so much more than that, that is one of its primary functions. Certainly formulas. Formulas. We spend so much time working with formulas and performing lots of different calculations. And we also use Excel for tracking people and events as a project management tool and so forth. We use Excel constantly for those of you particularly that are hospital based for those departmental budgets. We're about in that season now of budget time, and the number crunchers in finance are asking us to project, to recap our actual expenses and look at our expected expenses in the coming year. And so all of these things are tools that we use for Microsoft Excel all the time. These are all very helpful and useful. And lastly, we use Excel for doing a lot of data analysis, whether we're analyzing admission data, visits, we're scheduling reviews. All of these things that we use Microsoft Excel for are helpful, are useful. They're things that we couldn't live without in today's world. But one of the weaknesses of Excel is that sometimes the data that we want is external to Excel. We want to be able to pull that data from a third-party source. So today we're going to talk about this phenomenon. How many times have you heard, I know that we have that data someplace, but I just don't know where? And so many of us that work in hospitals find that we find frequently want to be able to integrate data from other third-party sources, be it a clinical database, an administrative database, perhaps your financial system. We've created a spreadsheet, and we want to take data in that spreadsheet and augment it by additional information, and we don't want to have to go through all of the effort of rekeying, as they used to say, that information. So today we're going to focus on pulling data in from different sources. We're going to be talking about bringing data, harvesting, if you will, harvesting data from external data sources. We'll be talking about how to import data from a text file. We'll be spending a lot of time talking about importing data from a PDF file, and we'll spend some time talking about importing data from a website. Now, there are many other ways that one can pull data into Microsoft Excel from external sources, but these seem to be the three major ways that the HIM professionals that I encounter in my business life expect to be able to use Excel, or in fact are using Excel, pulling data from one of these three sources, either a text file, a PDF file, or a website. So we're going to focus on these three mechanisms today. I'm going to review and go through some examples of how data can be pulled from a text file, from a PDF file, and from a website. If you have any questions, by all means, you can send them to us. We'll be happy to answer as many as we can. Now, let's begin at the beginning. Let's talk about importing data from a text file. And to be able to do this effectively, you need to know a little bit about how data is structured when it is physically arranged inside of the computer. So many of us are used to pulling data, and when we pull the data over, we get such unexpected results. And I want to give you two examples of how data typically will come over. There are three things we're concerned about when we pull data from a text file. We're certainly concerned about the location of the text file. So it's incumbent upon us to identify the location of that text file, whether it's another computer, whether it's a network, perhaps it's an FTP site, maybe somebody's giving it to us in a secure way via email. So we've got to identify where that text file is located. We've got to identify the format of the text file. Now, this sounds more difficult than it really is. We're going to talk about exactly how to do that in a few moments. And finally, we have to actually run the data import utility. And what the data import utility does is it takes the parameters that we've put on the data and makes some sense. It enables us to make some sense of the data that we're looking at. Now, when data is exported to a text file from a third-party software package, be it a billing system or a clinical system or what have you, it typically will come in one of two ways. Frequently, we will see the data separated with what we call commas. The second thing that we have to do is we have to identify the format of the text file that contains the data that we want. And then lastly, we need to run a data import utility, and this data import utility will make sense of the data that we want. So let me give you an example of what the data actually looks like when it physically comes off of the computer. If you notice in front of you right now, you will see a data file that I've pulled off, and you can see that we are in this particular file collecting the patient's account number, their financial class, the insurance company, their carrier that is to say, and the effective date of that policy. And for every patient in this particular file, we're collecting these four pieces of information. You'll notice that at the top I've got a header row, and that header row is separated by commas. Each field is separated by commas, which is coincidentally what we call this. We call this a comma delimited file. So each one of these fields is going to be separated by the comma, and that becomes very important when we pull this information to Excel, because Excel is going to make a decision. It's going to say, where do we put the account number? Where do we put the patient's financial class? Where do we put the insurance company? And where do we put the effective date? Another way that data sometimes comes across is what we call with spaces. Notice that this file looks a bit different than the other file. We see the account number clearly down here, followed by an even number of spaces, followed by the patient's financial class, and a number of spaces, the insurance carrier, and then the effective date. So these two ways that you're seeing the data here, on the left with commas, delimited with commas, on the right, delimited with spaces, are the two typical ways that files will come across and that we will use for importing that data into Microsoft Excel. So what I'll now do is I'll show you how we can pull the data. We're going to pull the data, we're going to identify the data as it comes across, and then we're going to run a data import utility, which will tell our Excel spreadsheet exactly how to set up the data. Now notice when we first pull over the data, I had said earlier that we have to identify a location of the file and the file type. We will then look at that data, and you'll see our two different choices, the delimited data or the fixed field data. We'll then go through a utility, and notice where you see step 1 of 3. This is what we call the text import wizard. By running this utility, what Microsoft Excel will do is it will take us through using the delimited feature that I described earlier of pulling our data over and allowing us to import the data directly into Excel. Notice that when I first pull the data up, the text wizard Notice when I pull the data up, the text wizard tells me that it's going to be running a utility that consists of 3 steps. The first, after I pulled the data up, I then will look at the data. I'll physically inspect the data down here, and I'm looking for any inconsistencies. I then will then click on where it says Next down below. It will take me to step 2 of our text data import. And notice that what I've done here, I've clicked on my utility, on my text utility, that I want the data to be separated by tabs and commas. So when I click these 2 features of the data import utility, Excel will make certain decisions based upon the way it thinks. It will make its best guess as to how that data is going to be arrayed, how that data is going to be laid out. When I'm done with this, after I've checked on the tab and the comma, I'm then going to click the Next button. And this last step, I'm going to run the import utility, which is my 3rd step. And in this step, I define for Excel whether the data that I'm bringing over is of a text nature, whether it is of a general nature, which would mean that it's numeric, or whether it's set up as a date. So what we're trying to do, ladies and gentlemen, is we're trying to define for Excel exactly what the data will look like, because Excel has to be ready to receive this data in a way that makes sense. When I'm all done defining my various columns, I then click the Finish button, and notice what happens. The data comes over into Excel. It comes over fairly well. It may not be 100% consistent, but it comes over and the data is set up in columns A through D, as you see here. I'm going to actually demonstrate this now, and hopefully you'll get a sense of exactly how we do this. I'm going to create a new spreadsheet, and now I'm going to import the data. I click File, Open. I'm now looking for my data. Notice I'm looking in my folder, and I'm looking for that file, that text file that defines that data that I want to bring over. The problem is I don't see it. Why don't I see that data? Well, I don't see the data because down here in the lower right-hand corner, it's asking me what type of data I want to bring over. It's not an Excel file. I want to bring over a text file. So I go down, I choose my down arrow key, I select where it says text files, and notice, lo and behold, I've got 2 insurance files, one that is delimited with commas, one that's delimited with spaces. I'm going to choose my comma file first. I click OK, and I then click Open. Here you see the first step of 3 of our text import wizard that you saw just a few moments ago. Notice here I can inspect my data. I can tell Excel what row to begin my data import on. I can even scroll down a little bit and I can look and see if there are any oddities in my data. Once I'm all set, I decide, yes, this is in fact the data that I want. I'm going to bring the data over in a delimited fashion. I then simply click Next. I'm now on step 2 of my text import wizard. I tell Excel, yes, each field is separated by what? A comma, and Excel will make this decision for me. Excel then goes in and says, here's the account number, here's the financial class, the insurance company, and the effective date of the policy. I'm now going to click on Next, and on step 3 of Microsoft Excel, import wizard, what I now do is I define each one of my columns. I go in individually, I define each column, and I define, am I going to leave it as general, or am I going to bring it in as text or a date? Well, my account number, I'm going to bring over as text. We'll talk a little bit later about why an account number and a medical record number is treated as text rather than a numeric. I now am going to bring over the patient's financial class as text. I'll bring over the insurance carrier as text, and I'll bring over the effective date of the policy as a date. Once I'm all done with that, I then click Finish, and lo and behold, you see that I brought my data over. I may have to make my columns a little bit wider. I may have to do a little bit of cleanup of data, but you can see that the way I've brought the data over is pretty good. It's pretty clean. I can tell what my financial class is. I can tell what my insurance carrier is, and so on and so forth. So that is the most common method that we use for bringing data over. This is called a text file delimited with commas, and normally when you receive data like this, the first time you bring it over, the first time you import it into Excel, you might find that the file doesn't line up, your columns don't line up perfectly. Sometimes there are inconsistencies in the data that come over that we have to account for. Occasionally we have to make some provision for embedded fields that may be in there that we didn't expect to be in there. But in general, most of the time that we bring data over with commas, it's pretty stable. Now I'm going to demonstrate how to bring data over that's in a fixed format. This is where each field of data occupies the same relative position in the file that we bring over. We see this very common if we're bringing data over from systems, for example, from the lab or from the pharmacy or from the radiology department, or some credentialing programs will do this. And while the mechanism for doing this is pretty much the same as with the comma delimited, we have to make certain provisions for bringing the data over and defining the data in a slightly different fashion. So what I'm now going to do is I'm going to click File, Open. I'm then going to highlight my field that says Insurance with spaces. And you'll notice that when I highlight it, over on the right side of the screen, you'll actually physically see the text file. I then click Open. It now says to me, the text import wizard is going to run. It now says to me, how is the data coming over? I want to tell it it's coming over in a fixed width length. I then click Next. I then will go and I will indicate exactly where each one of the files are physically located. I then click Next. All right, so now we are going to import data, not using a comma delimited format that you saw before, but rather we're going to import data using what we call a format with space delimited, with spaces. And so what our file looks like is this. The way the data comes off the computer, it's already aligned. As you see here, the patient's account number is in a column, the financial class is in its own column, and so on and so forth for the insurance company and the effective date. So this data will look a bit different than the data that we saw earlier. So now I'm going to go to Microsoft Excel, and I'm going to import the data in a fixed format style. I'm going to import the data in a fixed format style, and my file is called Insurance with Spaces. You notice when I highlight it, I can see it over here. I then click Open. As I inspect my data, I can see that the data lines up fairly cleanly. It's not always this clean, but I can see actually the way my data is set up. So I'm going to now indicate that I want to bring the data over in a fixed width format. I then click Next. Notice that Excel will do its best to create a vertical line where it sees the beginning of the next field. So it creates a file delimiter, rather a field delimiter, right before the financial class, right before the carrier, and right before the effective date. From this point on, it will be pretty much the way we saw it last time. I'm going to click Next. I'm going to define that my account number is text. My financial class will also be text. The carrier, the name of the carrier will be text. And finally, the effective date will be brought over as a date using the month, day, year convention. I then click Fixed. The data comes over, and I see that it's fairly clean. Is it perfect? No, it's not necessarily perfect, but I'm able to, without having to do lots of redundant data entry, I'm able to pull the data over, and then I can save it if I'd like to. I can move this data anywhere. I can cut, I can paste, I can do anything that I want with this data, and I've brought it over not only in a fixed file format, but I've also brought it over in a delimited file format. So just to refresh your memory, so now I'm able to pull the data in from, I can pull the data in from a text file. It will align fairly well in Microsoft Excel, and I'm then able to work with the data in pretty much any format that I want. I can sort it, I can send it into another file, I can do pretty much anything that I want to do. So importing data from a text file is relatively simple, relatively easy, but the user does have to make certain decisions about the way the data is coming over, and the user has to make some assumptions about how that data will be used. We'll talk more about this in a little bit. I now want to go on to another topic that's near and dear to many people's hearts. What happens when I want to import data from a PDF file? PDF files, as you know, allow us to be able to stabilize information and send information in a format that is relatively uneditable. But sometimes we want to be able to take data, particularly data that's in a table format, and bring it into Excel from a PDF file. It may be statistical data from a regulator or a state agency. It might be demographic information. There are many different reasons why we might want to bring information into a PDF file. So importing data from PDF files really involves 3 steps. First, we select the file, and we've got to know the name of the file. We then either copy and paste data directly from the screen, or we run an export utility. Either method will work. And then the last thing is we do an edit. We edit the worksheet and we clean it up a bit. So the first thing that I'm going to do is I'm going to show you an example. I'm going to now import some population data, which I got off the New Jersey Health Department's website. And you'll see that even though, and here's the URL for this file, you'll be able to get it yourself if you like. The file, this file is in what's called an HTML format, but the information that I want down here, the population data for the state of New Jersey as of 2005, is in a PDF form. How do I know that? It's in a PDF form because the state of New Jersey has a convention. Wherever they have a PDF file, they display a number there that tells me how large that file is. So when I click on that 72, it then takes me, it opens up this file, which happens to be abridged race population estimate by age, race, and ethnicity, and sex for use with birth data for the year 2005. I highlight the table over here on the left-hand side, and I then run an export utility, which is part and parcel of the New Jersey Health Department's website. Now, in order to run this particular utility, I have to subscribe to Adobe. Adobe charges about $20 a year, and for that $20 a year, it allows me to import any data from PDF into a Excel file. A real bargain, I think, and it does it very well, and it does it very efficiently. So the first thing that I do is I select my file name, which is right over here. It happens to be called pop05.pdf. The utility will then ask me, what do I want to convert it to? Do I want to convert it to a Word 2007 or 2010 version, an Excel format, or an old Word format, or maybe a rich text file format? I can do any of those things. I then sign into Adobe with my password. You get that when you sign up for this $20 a year service. I then watch, and as Adobe formats the data, as it converts the data, it displays several messages to me. It tells me that it's in the midst of converting the data using this utility called Adobe Export PDF Online. When it's all done, it will then tell me that it's completed the data and ask me if I want to save my converted file. Naturally, I would like to save my file, so I'll click on Save the File. It will ask me where I want to save this file, and it will ask me to give it a name. I will then give it a name. I click on Save, and my data looks something like this. Now, that may not look pretty to you. That may not look about the way you want it to look, but understand that we've just done the first step of bringing the data over from a PDF format into Excel. It's a bit jumbled because Excel has to interpret all of the text that's at the top of my PDF file. Once I click OK and finish, the data will then come over and it will look much nicer. It will look something like what you see in front of you now. I've hidden the first 20 lines of this table simply for the sake of displaying this in an efficient format to you. You'll notice on the left-hand side that I'm starting at row 20. And you see that I've got the patient age cohorts, the total with a breakdown by race, and within each race by gender. And so you're able to get from a PDF file, which really can't be edited, to an Excel file, which easily can be edited without a lot of difficulty. And as I said, we use this utility that I told you about earlier. If you go to adobe.com and you look up Adobe Export PDF, you'll see that utility available. You can sign into Adobe and purchase it if you haven't already. I believe that it comes standard if you buy the full Adobe Office suite of software. It will import the data, you'll save the data, and then you'll clean up the data and you'll be left with a very nice, very clean Excel file, which of course you will then save as an XLS file if you haven't already. You can see that moving the data from Excel into PDF doesn't take a lot of effort. It's a pretty straightforward process, and when you're done, you've got something that you can work with very easily. All right, now we are going to talk about how we import data into Excel from a website. Getting external data from the web is really pretty easy using Microsoft Excel. You can pull the data over fairly quickly, fairly easily, but like we saw before, pulling data over from a PDF file, you may find that you need to work with the data a little bit. You may need to do some data rearranging, you may need to clean up some files, you may need to do some quality control. So what I'm going to show you here is a technique that we use all the time for looking at county level health indicator information in New York State. But you can use just about any data that's on the web for this purpose. The data that works best is data that's already in a tabular form, although you can bring over straight text from a website directly into Excel. All right, the first thing that I need to do is I need to indicate on the second row of my icons that that the data is going to be originating from the web. I then click from the web, and it will then prompt me to do a query, what's called a web query. I put in the address line here the URL associated with the particular website that contains the data that I want to bring over. This happens to be New York City health indicator data that's in an HTML format. Once I click import down here in the lower right hand side, something that the data will come over in a way similar to what you see. Your screen may be a little bit different than this. It may be a little bit larger. It may be a little bit smaller. And it's just giving me a view of what this data is going to look like. This happens to be county health profile data from the 2005-2009 period for all of the 5 boroughs of New York City. And in the lower right-hand side, I click Import. And when I click Import, the utility is going to ask me where we want to put the data. So I'm going to be lazy here. I'm just going to indicate that I want the data to go into cell A1 of my folder, of my worksheet. I could put it anywhere that I'd like. I click OK, and lo and behold, the data comes over. You'll see at the top of column A, you'll see what looks like a text version of the website that we saw earlier. Department of Health. It's got an indicator for the home. And when I go to my next page, I scroll down, and you'll see that I've got on the lower left-hand side of my screen, the data lines up very nicely. The data lines up. It gives me my population information, my unemployment information, my percent in poverty. If it can't find the data, it gives me an NA. It looks exactly like the website did without all the formatting. You'll notice one other thing that I've done here. When the data comes over, I have highlighted cell B4, and I've indicated that I want to use the merge cell utility. What this allows me to do is to have one title for the year for both the number and the rate associated with each data point that I'm bringing over. This is simply just one mechanism that I use for cleaning up the data. So when I bring the data over from the website, I will need to go do a little bit of cleaning up. I'll need to go through the data, maybe reformat some of the columns. When I get all done with that, after I import the data from the website, you'll notice that I have to do a little bit of cleaning up. What I've done here is I've indicated for every year, if you notice that the state of New York gives me both a number and a rate associated with each data point. What I need to do here as one part of the cleanup is I need to define that each year spans 2 columns. So I simply highlight my column, I click on Merge Cells, and then I click OK, and that will allow the year designator to span both the number and the rate column. When I'm all done doing my cleaning up, I then go to my next page, and lo and behold, I've now imported successfully the data from the web directly into Microsoft Excel. Notice that at the bottom of each column, you'll have totals. You'll have column totals. Remember that these column totals are not based upon formulas that are within Excel. They're simply the summary of the data, the sum of the data as put out on the web. So you may find that you need to go in and reinitialize some of these formulas. You may need to actually put those formulas in for each one of the columns that would be associated with it. So what we have here is an example of importing the data from the web. We could then take this data, move it into whatever form that we wanted to, and then use it for comparative purposes. So in summary, what I think that we've got is the ability to do 3 things. Number 1, we've got the ability. All right, now we are going to do one other exercise. We are going to import data from a website directly into Microsoft Excel. This is really good. This utility is really good and very helpful because many times much of the data that we use, particularly the data that's maintained by either hospitals or state regulatory agencies or the federal government, is maintained on websites, and we'd like to be able to pull a portion of that data down and be able to manipulate it. In the past, importing this data into Excel from a website required a lot of effort, and it required a lot of splitting of data, something we call parsing of data. And fortunately, using the latest versions of Microsoft Excel, really from Excel 2007 onward, really are much better than the earlier versions of Excel for pulling data down. So in this case, we're going to get some external data from the web. What I do is I simply click on, at an empty spreadsheet, I click on File, and then I click on From the Web, which is going to enable me to get external data from the web. It's going to enable me to import data from a web page. I then put in the URL associated with the website that I want to pull data from. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to create what's called a new web query. That web query is going to enable me to go out to the New York State Department of Health's website, and it's going to go to the statistical section and pull an HTML file for New York City's the 5 boroughs of New York City's health indicator database. After I put in the URL for the website, the website will then display in Microsoft Excel. I can physically see the data, but it has not yet come into Microsoft Excel. I can visualize what I want. I can verify that, in fact, this is the data that I want. And when I'm satisfied that this is, in fact, the data that I want, I can then click on where it says in the lower right-hand corner, where it says Import. And Excel will ask me where it wants me to put the data, and it will then come over, it will import directly into my website, into my Excel spreadsheet. You'll see some introductory lines of data that will have the text version of the very top part of the spreadsheet. But when I scroll down, you'll see that the rest of the data comes in. Each data point, each line, each column comes in distinctly. In this case, you'll notice that some of the labels, the annual labels that the Department of Health has put at the top of each column, actually span 2 columns. So what I need to do here is to be able to differentiate the number from the rate for each one of these factors. I need to go into and format each column header, and I set it to be merge cells. I set my merge cells on, I click OK, and then when I click OK, my data comes over very nicely. You can see that the data lines up nicely, that each age cohort is completely identified with a total and a breakdown by race and by gender. You'll also notice that I've got totals at the bottom for the entire cohort for each group. You may want to change these to have a total for males, a total for females. You can handle it any way that you want to be able to do it. You may have to recreate the summary at the bottom, these summary formulas at the bottom, but you won't have to re-input all of this information, all of this detailed information. So in summary, what we've learned today is the ability to be able to import data from a text format. Okay, now our last exercise will involve importing data from a website. Importing data from the web is very useful, particularly because many of the organizations which healthcare administrators work with end up having to pull lots and lots of data from various regulatory areas. And so what we're going to be doing today is pulling data directly from a website that I've chosen because it's an easy website to work with and it's an easy website to demonstrate. Now, when you pull data from a website, you're essentially creating what is known as a web query. What we are going to do is we're going to click on a blank spreadsheet, we're going to click on File, and then we're going to click From the Web, and we're going to say Get External Data. Once I've done this, I click on From the Web. It will then create a new web query for me. At this point, I simply put in the address of the website that I'd like to pull data from. In this case, it happens to be the New York Department of Health. I'm going to bring down, I'm going to download the health county indicators for the 5 boroughs of New York City. I put that in where it says address, and then I click OK. After I've done that, the county health indicator profiles will come down. It still has not pulled it into a Microsoft Excel worksheet. It's simply showing me the data that it's going to bring in this area here. I'm able to verify that this in fact is the data that I want to bring in. I will then click on where it says import in the lower right hand corner. It will ask me the location that I would like to put this data on my spreadsheet. I then click OK. And then the data will physically come directly onto the spreadsheet. You'll see a number of columns and a number of rows at the top which contain the credit information, the source of the information. But the meat of what we want to get to is located a little bit further down. I'm going to jump down to line 20. And here I'm going to eliminate the first 20 lines, and then you're going to see the sociodemographic information and each data point that's been brought down from the website from the New York Department of Health. Notice that every year has actually 2 columns of data associated with it. It's got a frequency count and it's got a calculated rate. So in order to be able to span the year designation over both columns, I need for each year to be able to go in and indicate that I use the alignment merge cells utility. I click OK. And then I'm able to pull in the information, and as you can see, it pulls the data in very nicely directly from the web. Note that I've got column totals here that represent the sum total for both males and females. You might want to change those here. You might want to put your own formulas so that you have a total for males, a total for females, for each one of the racial cohorts. That's completely up to you. So you can see that it's very easy to import data directly into Microsoft Excel from the web. You just have to make sure that you do it in a very structured manner. You pull the data over, you direct the file, and then you indicate exactly how you want the file to physically be set up on your spreadsheet. So in summary, what we've seen today is that we've pulled data from a text format, in this case an ASCII, a delimited with comma format. We've pulled data from a PDF file, and we've pulled data directly from the web. All of 3 formats of data can easily go down to be downloaded into an Excel spreadsheet. It takes a little bit of effort. It takes a little bit of time. You have to pull the data down in a structured format, but when you're all done, you should be able to use this data and avoid all of that redundant entry. I hope that this seminar has been useful for you. I hope that you're able to pull data down from both a text, a PDF, or the web formats. If you have any questions, you're certainly welcome to forward those questions to me. Thank you very much for your participation. I look forward to hearing from you in the future. Goodbye.